long Civil War is over, leaving behind a heritage of bitterness. The memory of 600,000 dead. How shall the nation bind up its wounds and create a lasting and meaningful peace? It is one of the most troubled and confused times in American history. The years of Reconstruction. While the war goes on, one man thinks constantly of the problems of peace. Abraham Lincoln has never recognized the right of the Confederate States to secede. He views the fighting as a rebellion. As such, it is the job of the president to end it and bring the 11 seceding states back into the Union. Lincoln does not plan to punish the South, but as he says,
let him up easy.
As early as 1863, he is preparing a general amnesty, a pardon to all those who will take an oath of loyalty to the United States. If as few as 10% of the 1860 voters in any rebel state take the oath, a government can be formed, and that state can rejoin the Union. Many members of Lincoln's own party oppose his plan as too lenient. They believe the South should be punished. These men feel that this is not a rebellion, but a full-fledged war, and as such, only Congress, and not the President, has the right to control Reconstruction. This vital issue is still unresolved when the President is assassinated. The shot that takes the life of Abraham Lincoln elevates to the presidency Andrew Johnson. Ironically, a Democrat, a Southerner, and a former slave owner. Johnson inherits not only the presidency, but Lincoln's old quarrel with the Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens. Stevens believes that Southern leaders must be punished.
Humble the traitors, strip them of their lands, send their children to work in the fields.
Stevens goes so far as to suggest that the plantations of wealthy slave owners be divided up into 40-acre farms and sold off at $10 an acre to their former slaves. This clash between those who want a hard peace and those who will accept a soft peace, this quarrel between a Democratic president and a Republican Congress, will shape the face of the nation for the next 100 years. April 15th, 1865. Seldom has a man ascended to the presidency in more difficult times than Andrew Johnson. Less than a week earlier, Lee had surrendered his armies to Grant, and the soldiers began to leave the battlefields. Returning home, the Northern soldier sees a prosperous land, bursting with confidence in the future. A region whose industry has grown tremendously due to large war orders. Returning home, the Southern soldier sees the death of a cherished dream. Proud plantation homes, neglected and beginning to decay. Transportation wrecked. Cities in ruins. A Southern woman writes,
"We are in a transition state from war to subjugation. And it is far worse than the transition from peace to war. We have no currency, no laws, save the primitive code that might makes right. The suspense and anxiety in which we live are terrible.
And for the 4 million Negroes now legally free, where is home? Thousands wander the countryside, adrift like refugees in their own land. For white and Negro alike, the first, the most important problem is simply to stay alive. Under Lincoln, Congress has formed the Freedmen's Bureau to assist the former slaves in making the transition to freedom. Now the Bureau begins to feed the hungry, issuing rations not only to Negroes, but to needy whites.
Even Confederate soldiers are fed. There is much in this that takes away the bitter sting.
August 1865, Washington, D.C. All summer long, with Congress adjourned, President Johnson urges the former rebel states to take his oath of amnesty, much like Lincoln's, and rejoin the Union as fast as possible. And as the president pardons more and more Southern leaders, there is a growing feeling that perhaps the region can rebuild its old institutions. If much is destroyed, the land remains. Now with fields to be cleared, crops to be planted, Negroes and whites need each other. Some new way must be found for them to live and work together. At first, plantation owners try to pay wages to their former slaves, but the shortage of cash soon leads to a crop-sharing system. Some former slaves now work the same fields for the same masters. Some continue to live in the same old slave cabins. Southerners begin to say,
"It is the white man of the South who has been freed by this war."
but others begin to wonder.
Has the Negro only exchanged one kind of slavery for a different kind of servitude?
December 1865. Republican leaders returned to Washington to find that 8 former rebel states have taken advantage of the generous Johnson amnesty, have taken the oath, and have sent their congressmen and senators to Washington. Among those elected are former Confederate generals and high officers in the rebel army. The group even includes Alexander Stephens, the man who was vice president of the Confederate States. A northern congressman says angrily,
What in blazes is the use of fighting a war if Jefferson Davis and the Confederates can turn right around and win back the Capitol and the White House?
and ironically, having fought a war in defense of slavery and lost. These former Confederates are now being returned with more power than before the war. Before the war, in southern states, each slave was counted as 3/5 of a person. But if the former slaves, who still have no vote, are now to be counted as full citizens, the white Southern Democrats will have more representatives in Congress and hold more political power than before the war. The radical Republicans of the North recognize an immediate political threat from the suddenly revived Southern Democrats. They are furious that a president whom they consider a political accident has moved without consulting them. Now they become suspicious of President Johnson. Remember that he is a Southern Democrat, a former slave owner. Under Thaddeus Stevens, Congress refuses to seat the new members. First, it will hold a congressional investigation to see if the spirit and intent of the 13th Amendment is being carried out in the South. Congress wants to know, how are the 4 million freed Negroes being treated? Are they being granted their proper rights? Congress learns that to control the freed slaves, white legislators in each of the former Confederate states have passed new laws. Under these new black codes, former slaves can own property, can make their own contracts, have the right to sue and be sued. But in no Southern courthouse can a Negro serve on a jury. Under no circumstances can he testify in court against a white. No Negro may possess a firearm, and if he leaves his place of employment, he must have a pass. And any Negro found idle, unable to prove employment, can be arrested and charged as a vagrant. Convicted, he can then be bound over to work as forced convict labor for any white man who will pay his fine. Any idle teenage Negro can be bound over as an apprentice and forced to work for a period of years for any white who promises to teach him a trade. To the radical Republicans of the North, these new black codes seem only a familiar echo of the harsh old slave codes. They seem to negate the whole purpose for which the war was fought and won. Is slavery dead? Reaction is swift. March 1866. Congress passes the first civil rights bill in American history, invalidating the black codes and granting to Negroes the same rights as whites. But President Johnson vetoes this bill. He says it is a violation of states' rights. An angry Congress not only overrides his veto, but now proposes the 14th Amendment, which says no state can abridge the rights of any citizen. The President and Congress are on a collision course. They can agree on nothing. Now, with new congressional elections coming up, an aroused president decides to tour the country and take his case to the people. Wherever his train stops, he addresses the voters. He attacks Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans.
I tell you, my friends, that there are in the North disunionists more dangerous than their former secessionists.
Do you mean Thaddeus Stevens?
Thaddeus Stevens is a traitor. Where I come from, he'd be hung.
Johnson's intemperate words damage his own cause. In the November congressional elections, the radical Republicans are returned more firmly in control of Congress than before. But even though the Republicans are numerically strong in the North, they are hated and have no support in the South. There is only one way the Republicans can build support for their party in the South: by giving the Negro the right to vote. Now, for the best of reasons and for the worst of reasons, to win for the Negro his rightful place in the national life, and to punish the president, radical Republicans pass sweeping new Reconstruction Acts. 10 former Confederate states are now reshuffled and combined into 5 new military districts. Like a conquered province, each of these new districts is to be ruled by a military governor. And in each new district, while whites who took up arms voluntarily for the Confederacy are to be disenfranchised, all loyal citizens, including Negroes, are to be registered for voting. Southerners are staggered. President Johnson is outraged.
The Negroes have not asked for the right to vote, and they are too ignorant to vote. Negro voting will be the first step in a dangerous attempt to Africanize the South.
Uneducated, largely illiterate, is the Negro ready for voting? An uneducated former slave replies,
I believe, my friends and fellow citizens, we're not prepared for this suffrage. But we can learn.
Now, as Johnson continues to fight the intent of Congress, Congress determines once and for all to strip the man in the White House of all power. It passes the Tenure of Office Act, saying the president is not permitted to change or remove any member of his own cabinet. Believing this unconstitutional, the president fires his antagonistic Secretary of War, Stanton. February 24th, 1868, Washington, D.C. An impeachment trial of a president of the United States. In a Roman circus atmosphere, with impeachment tickets at a premium, the trial goes on for months. So ill, he must be carried in a chair into the chamber. Thaddeus Stevens directs the fight. It soon becomes clear that Stevens and his group have the votes they need to topple the president. But as the voting goes into its final stages, thoughtful men begin to reconsider. It will be easy to topple this president. But if they do, will any American president ever be able to conduct a government against the wishes of Congress? 5 senators change their votes. The impeachment fails by a single vote. But already this trial seems unimportant. In a few months, Thaddeus Stevens will be dead. And Andrew Johnson is already passing into political oblivion. General Ulysses S. Grant has been nominated and will be elected 18th President of the United States. Now, as the Johnson administration comes to a close, Reconstruction is entering a second and more bitter stage. In the former rebel states in the South, former slaves have received the right to vote. In some states, Negro voters now outnumber whites. But secret societies dedicated to white supremacy are gathering strength. The stage is set for violence. March 4th, 1869. Grant takes office. 2 months later, the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. America is entering a prosperous new age. But while the rest of the country is moving forward into a bright new future, the South is a region apart. While some Southern leaders who fought for the Confederacy are still disenfranchised, the Congressional Reconstruction Acts and the new 14th Amendment have given the former slaves new civil rights. In the former rebel states, Negroes are casting ballots, serving on juries, being elected to state legislatures and to Congress. 2 Negroes will serve as United States Senators. One, Hiram Revels, will occupy the seat formerly held by Jefferson Davis. Resentment in the South is high. It is said that men like these, only a few years out of slavery, are too ignorant of the law, too uneducated to hold public office. At no time do Negroes ever dominate the governments of any of the former rebel states. But what makes the job of those who are elected almost impossible is not only prejudice, but the fact that Reconstruction government, by its very nature, is expensive. Now, with the economy shattered and no money for taxes, the South suddenly needs a complete new school system. But because there is a demand to keep the races separate, most states need not one, but 2 separate and complete school systems. Negro legislators who pass laws for these new schools are denounced as ignorant, as wasteful. They are pictured as criminals who are impoverishing the South with outrageous new taxes. The whole idea of Negro education is bitterly attacked. It is said,
Negro education will be the ruin of the South. Learning will spoil the Negroes for work.
Negro attitudes are conciliatory. A Negro legislator in South Carolina says,
Let us be like the black and white keys of a piano. independent in their construction, but intended for combination, when blended together, making a thrilling degree of musical perfection.
But in the climate of bitterness after the war, this hoped-for harmony is made more and more impossible. James Alcorn, a wealthy planter who becomes the first Republican governor in Mississippi, says of the Negroes in his state,
I propose to vote with him, to discuss political affairs with him, and to pluck our common liberty and our common prosperity out of the jaws of inevitable ruin.
But Southern white leaders like Alcorn, who are prepared to cooperate with Negroes, are denounced as scallywags, traitors to their own class. They and their families are shunned and socially ostracized. Northern whites who try to work with Negroes are caricatured as carpetbaggers, men who come south with their empty carpetbags, hoping to return swollen with riches and profits from Southern misery. Sympathetic women who come to teach school and to try to help the Negroes make the transition to freedom are denounced and viciously insulted. Schools attempting to teach Negroes are burned by night riders. Formed immediately after the war, the Ku Klux Klan has never ceased its campaign to keep the Negro in his place. Now to keep the Negro from voting, to drive him completely from public office, the Klan, together with similar organizations, steps up its terror tactics. They ride at night, terrorizing, whipping, and murdering Negroes and whites who defend them. Negroes known to be active politically are ordered out of their homes. White planters refuse to rent land to any Negro known to be a Republican. Storekeepers refuse to give them credit. In the presidential election of 1876, Southern Negroes are warned not to vote. In some communities, coffins are paraded through the streets, conspicuously marked with the names of Negro leaders. On Election Day, 1876, Negroes hide by the thousands in the swamps, too terrified to even go near the polls. 8 years earlier, their votes had helped elect Grant by a plurality of 300,000. Now the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, winds up just 300,000 votes short of the Democrat, Samuel Tilden. But while Tilden has a clear majority of the popular vote, he does not have a clear majority in the Electoral College. There are many voting irregularities. The votes in some southern states are in dispute. Southern Democrats agree to accept the Republican Hayes as president, provided the federal troops are removed from the South, a Southerner is appointed to the cabinet, and the federal government helps build a railroad across the South. April 10th, 1877. 1 month after he becomes president, Rutherford B. Hayes withdraws the last of the federal troops. Reconstruction is over. If it is to be remembered as the tragic era, the dreadful decade, it can also be remembered as the beginning, a time when freed Negroes began to take up their rightful place in American life. But in the climate of bitterness after the war, no real progress was possible. Reconstruction had lasted so brief a time. In most cases, the period of Reconstruction in the South was over almost before it started, leaving problems that still remain to be settled 100 years later. year is 1763. A rumble of discontent sweeps through the American colonies. The continuous westward expansion of the people in the colonies has been ordered to come to a halt. In far-off England, the king has issued a proclamation.
The American colonists must not go beyond the crest of the Appalachians.
Beyond the mountains are fierce tribes of Indians and the warring French. The king has few troops. He can guarantee no protection beyond this line. The colonists are few in number. There is plenty of untaken land in the north and in the south. Why do they feel that an open frontier to the west is so important? In the beginning, America is a frontier of Europe. To the New World, in tiny ships, come people in search of a better life. In the Europe from which most have fled, a man is a prisoner in the class to which he is born. Here in the New World, there was greater opportunity for Europeans to be free. The abundant land waiting just beyond the forest is a promise to the landless, a challenge to the pioneer, a place to escape from intolerance. But what lies out there in the wilderness? Fearfully at first, some colonists move into the forest. They test their strength against Indians and wild animals. They learn to adapt to new situations, new challenges. And as they move further west, as they begin to conquer the wilderness, as they grow in strength and confidence, they begin to change. Frontier life begins to breed a restless new kind of man, used to freedom, intolerant of restraints. By 1750, from a handful of tiny settlements on the edge of the Atlantic, the colonists have penetrated to the foothills of the Appalachians. But in 1763, the continuous westward expansion of the people in the colonies is ordered to halt. The king warns he can give no protection beyond the Appalachians. But America has bred men who do not want protection, men who refuse to be stopped. In the backwoods of North Carolina, a frontiersman sits in his rude cabin and dreams of the land beyond the mountains.
A fellow that's been there told me there's grass thick with deer. And there's turkeys. So many there's just not room for all of them to fly at the same time.
His name is Daniel Boone, one of the new breed. He blazes the wilderness trail and then returns to lead others into the new colony he and the land promoters who have hired him are beginning to call Transylvania. And the further men like this go west, less and less they need the king far away across the ocean. Why pay him a tax on tea? A tax on salt? A tax on anything? Men like this are beginning to say,
who needs a king anyway?
By the time of the Revolution, men in the West are ready and eager to fight. George Rogers Clark leads a small band of frontiersmen to raid British forts in the Northwest. He wins a victory at Vincennes that lays the basis for claims to much of the Northwest territory. When the peace treaty with England is signed, The western boundary of the new republic reaches all the way to the Mississippi River. Now the Continental Congress begins to pass a series of ordinances guaranteeing the orderly development of the West. Settlers venturing into the new territories are guaranteed their full rights as American citizens. They are given the opportunity to buy land at auction. Minimum price, $1 an acre. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 prohibits slavery in the territory north of the Ohio River. Soldiers who have fought in the Revolutionary War spend their mustering out pay and journey west to buy land in the new territories. Hard times in the east brings a surge of new settlers. So many people flock west that by 1792, the territory that Daniel Boone has called Transylvania is accepted into the Union as the new state of Kentucky. By 1796, Tennessee becomes a state. By 1803, Ohio. And in 1803, the country once again stretches its borders. Thomas Jefferson makes the Louisiana Purchase and doubles the nation's size. Now the western boundary of the United States stretches all the way to the Rocky Mountains. To explore the new territory, Jefferson sends an expedition headed by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. Lewis and Clark's assignment? To go where none but Indians have gone before, to chart the unknown, to fill in the empty spaces on the map. And so begins an incredible journey. Exploring rivers, making friends with the Indians, and learning their ways. Crossing on foot the Continental Divide. 28 months later, they report,
Honorable Thomas Jefferson, sir, in obedience to your orders, we have penetrated the continent of North America to the Pacific Ocean.
Lewis and Clark's report of rich virgin lands awaiting pioneers fires the imagination of the American people and sends a new wave of settlers west. Explorers are followed by fur trappers, backwoodsmen, far-roaming mountain men are followed by farmers. Now with Eastern manufacturers looking eagerly to the expanding market in the West. And Western farmers shipping their crops east. There is a demand for new and better means of transportation. Better roads and turnpikes are built. In 1811, the National Road is begun. When it is finally completed, many years later, it is 60 feet wide and stretches 600 miles from Maryland to Illinois. Over this broad national road travel covered wagons and the western mails. Inns spring up. Down the road come droves of cattle herded east to market. Sometimes the road is as crowded as the main street of a small town. The national road connects at Wheeling with the Ohio River. From here, Western travelers may continue their journey by flatboat. Water transportation is cheap and comfortable. In 1825, the Great Erie Canal is finally completed and becomes the most famous highway to the West. Settlers can now travel by water from New York to Buffalo and across the Great Lakes to Chicago, gateway to the West. Newly arrived immigrants from Europe join New Englanders and New Yorkers and travel westward on the Erie in ever-increasing numbers. The West is beginning to fill up, beginning to feel its muscles, beginning to make its voice heard. By 1830, 1/3 of the American people live west of the Appalachians. Here life is hard. Comforts are few. But people learn to help one another. Sharing a common hardship, facing common danger, the people develop the idea they are equal. Here a man is valued, not for family, for inherited wealth, for years of schooling, but for what he can do. The West has a deep faith in democracy and the ability of the common man. Every adult white male is eligible to vote and to hold public office. Many of these new voters, Western farmers who support Andrew Jackson for president, want two things. First, they want cheap money, easy credit so they can buy more land. And second, because some of the best land is owned by Indians, because the Indian is a constant threat, they want the Indians removed. Under Jackson, the Indian Removal Act is carried out. In 1830, the government begins to move all the tribes east of the Mississippi, west, into tribal lands in Oklahoma, which is to be theirs forever. For many tribes, the result is tragic. The Cherokees, for example, a civilized nation, had developed their own written language. Nevertheless, they are removed by force and marched in the dead of winter to their new lands. So many die along the way. The Cherokees call this the Trail of Tears. The American hunger for more and more land continues unchecked. By 1845, a New York journalist coins the phrase manifest destiny, which says that as a people, we have a special destiny and that nothing can stop America's westward expansion until the nation reaches the Pacific Ocean. At a 4th of July picnic, a Western orator compares Americans to the buffalo.
Land enough! Land enough! Make way, I say, for the young American buffalo. He has not yet got land enough. I tell you, we will give him Oregon for his summer shade and Texas for his winter pasture.
The mood of the people is expansionist. 1845, Texas enters Union. 1846, Oregon country ours. 1848, as a result of the war with Mexico, the United States acquires a vast new area in the Southwest. Already Brigham Young has led his people into the new Utah territory. By 1847, the Mormons have settled on the shores of the Great Salt Lake and have begun to build a new Zion. In 1848, the cry of gold is heard in California and starts a new stampede west. already an issue is heating up that threatens to divide the nation. Slavery. Shall the new Western territories come into the Union as free or slave states? From the beginning of the nation, the issue of slavery in the new territories has been important. As early as 1787, the Northwest Ordinance had prohibited slavery in the new territory north of the Ohio River. In 1820, under the Missouri Compromise, with the single exception of Missouri, everything north of 3630 is closed to slavery. But as each new Western state applies for admission, the issue revives. Since slavery already exists in Texas, Texas is admitted as a slave state. Oregon enters free. Under the Compromise of 1850, California comes in as a free state. But Utah and New Mexico are to decide for themselves whether or not they want slavery. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act replaces the Missouri Compromise. The region west of Iowa and Missouri is to be divided into two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And the people of these new territories are to vote whether or not they want slavery. The result is disaster. Pro- and anti-slavery elements send people to influence the vote. Abolitionist societies send in settlers equipped with wagons, loaded with rifles. Pro-slavery elements send armed desperados. Some southern states send in their militia. In the struggle between North and South, the West becomes a bloody battleground. The fighting in Kansas and Nebraska is a rehearsal for the Civil War. (1862). In the midst of war, Abraham Lincoln signs two bills which are to have immense importance to the future of the West. The great westward movement of the American people has skipped the Great Plains, a land with so little water it is known as the Great American Desert. Now Lincoln signs the Homestead Act, which gives 160 acres of free land to encourage those who will settle here and to link the Atlantic coast with the Pacific. He signs a bill authorizing the construction of the long-dreamed-of transcontinental railroad. (1869), the Golden Spike that joins the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific is hammered into place. And with the coming of the first transcontinental railroad, the West begins its period of greatest expansion. The Western railroads have land to sell. Agents are sent abroad to advertise for immigrants in their native languages. People flock to the West from all over the world. A writer describes a scene in a Western town.
Trains swarming with immigrants, all seeking land.
Because so little rain falls on the Great Plains, the settlers learn to rely on windmills to pump water from deep wells. Because there is almost no timber, they learn to build their houses out of earth, learn to live in sod huts. And by their courage and their ingenuity, they begin to transform the Great Plains into one of the great granaries of the world. The coming of the Transcontinental Railroad brings the first great cattle drives. Cattle are driven to meet the railroad at Dodge City or Abilene. To the Indian, however, the railroad brings hunger. Buffalo crossing the plains in huge herds are a danger to locomotives and passengers. Hunters are hired to slaughter the herds. Of the once great herds, nothing is left but the bones. Frantic with hunger, desperate over the invasion of their lands, the Indians attack. To protect the settlers, the railroads and the wagon trains, soldiers are sent. The retaliation is savage. An overeager colonel, George Custer, pursues a Sioux raiding party and is led into a trap. At Little Bighorn, Custer and his troops are massacred. Angry, the army retaliates. The surrender of the Sioux is the beginning of the end of armed Indian resistance. By 1885, almost every Indian in the West has been placed on a reservation. The Old West is vanishing. Where teepees stood and campfires burned, towns and villages and cities are beginning to rise. In 1890, the director of census is saying,
"The country's unsettled area has been so broken into isolated bodies of settlement, there can hardly be said to be a frontier left."
Entering the 20th century, Americans took a look back and asked themselves what the open frontier in the West had meant in our history. Had it helped shape the character of the American people? From the beginning, the land waiting just beyond the forest was the promise of a chance for a better life. The promise gave hope, bred optimism. Conquering the wilderness, the people developed strength and self-reliance. Always on the move, we became a restless people. And sometimes, the easy opportunity for change made us wasteful. Often it was easier to use up than to preserve our natural resources. Life along the edge of the frontier was harsh and frequently violent. But sharing a common experience, people learned to help one another. It is the courage and the confidence, the boundless optimism, the ability to pick oneself up from failure and try again that are the characteristics Americans carry forward into the new frontiers, wherever they may be.